My guest today is Jamie Williams. Jamie is a seasoned professional in the field of cybersecurity, currently serving as a threat intelligence researcher at Palo Alto Networks' infamous Unit 42. Before joining Unit 42, he made significant contributions at the MITRE Corporation as a senior principal cyber operations engineer. During his tenure at MITRE, Jamie led the development of MITRE ATT&CK for enterprise, focusing on adversary emulation and behavior-based detections. In addition to his full-time role, Jamie is also a member of the IANS faculty, where he shares his extensive knowledge and experience with the cybersecurity community. With a rich background that includes time at the National Security Agency, Jamie brings a wealth of expertise to our discussion today. Thank you so much for being with us on the show today, Jamie. It's a real honor to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. That's a very flattering intro, too. I love that bio. I'm like listening. I'm like, whoa, that did happen. Good times.
Yeah, as I mentioned just before the show, I used ChatGPT to help bring it up to that next level.
AI's got my back. That's great to hear.
Yeah, I got to say, I love the robots. You know, there's a little bit of like stuff to be scared of there, but so far so good. Before we get into it, do you want to talk a little bit about the awesome work you folks do at Unit 42? We reference articles from your team all the time on the show.
Yeah, I've only been, in this position for going on a solid month and a half now, but it is amazing. Like, phenomenal researchers, and it really kind of captures that spirit of, providing threat intelligence to where it's needed. Whether it's IR cases or you mentioned blogs, public information sharing in the community. There's just so much richness in terms of the ability to see adversary. And, there's so many different data points. You can talk about IOCs and like specifics and all these like very, very low level stuff, or just broad trends of, hey, this is what's happening with ransomware. This is what's happening in this industry. But I think a lot of the magic is trying to figure out like not only what data do you have, but how do you draw insights out of that? And then the most important part is like who needs it? And like, where do they need it? How do they need it? How do I speak their language? How do I, not everyone's going to be an Intel professional. So how do you like meet people where they are and say, these insights are push you in the right direction, whether you're, over manufacturing plates over here, or you're, running a hospital or a school, whatever it may be. Like, how do we actually bring, the right perspective and the right kind of background to your attention so that even if you're just making tiny, tiny decisions, they're at least, kind of that much better, recognizing that, again, we're all in this together. So stories, let's grow, and, the ship floats together.
I'm speculating, but just based on the content you guys produce, I feel like it's you have a lot of freedom to do the work you see fit and have a broad mission statement. Is that somewhat accurate?
It's a little, it's probably the first time of many I'll say this today. Like, it depends. Because sometimes you kind of have to follow like the threat, and you get pulled into places you're like, I don't know if this is necessarily the most interesting thing to me, but this is the most actionable. Versus sometimes, exactly as you said, it's the researcher's intuition of, oh, that's interesting. And you almost have to forecast, like, no one's asking about this yet, no one's talking about this yet, but that's a thread that I think needs to get pulled because it's going to open up a whole different story and maybe have an opportunity to get ahead of something. So it's a little bit of balance of both of, okay, what do people need now? Because you definitely don't want to, if people have needs and, baby birds need to be fed, you don't want to, hey, like, don't worry about that. I'm looking ahead to the next, like, 6 months here. You kind of have to deal with the problems in front of you. Yeah. But at the same time, you don't want to spend so much time being proactive, or reactive, and saying, oh, wow, like, we've been satisfying the requests that are coming in, and then a new problem comes up, and then, like, I've spent zero time looking into this, and there's a whole new learning curve of like, what is this, and what are we going to do about it? You don't want to definitely never want to build the plane as you're flying it. So it's and I think that's, as a researcher, that's like one of those things we really lean into, is like that context switching and almost like chaotic prioritization of being able to kind of balance the best of both worlds.
Swapping between like deep thinking and digging ditches.
Right. Like, how do you like automate something that we necessarily haven't even built yet? You're like, that's just amazingly, I don't know, there's a project management cert out there somewhere for this magic, but we'll ad hoc it until it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. What initially drew you to this work? Were you like a nerdy kid growing up into computers, or was it later?
So funny enough, I actually wasn't into computers growing up. I thought I was going to be a professional baseball player. I was like, it makes so much sense to me. Like I love this so much. But I think what really drew me in was I always liked like math and engineering. So funny enough, I actually went to school to play baseball, and I wasn't really big into computers at the time. I was like, just put me in some engineering program. I don't really care. And thankfully, my advisor was like, you should do computers because like don't be dumb. But I think what really latched on to me is I just love storytelling. Like I come from a southern like Louisiana family, and like they talk all day, and like I just love how much like you can kind of like take something, a perspective, and kind of share it. And I think that's been a lot of the the best parts of my career is being able to kind of almost be a chameleon of like, hey, I can go to like malware REs and like get into like low level stuff and capture that perspective, go to executive boards, capture that perspective, meet somewhere in the middle. I just think there's so much richness. And I think that's one of the best ways, not to foot stomp CTI too much, but I think CTI is one of those things that really is the connective tissue in our industry of connecting like red teams, blue teams, SOC, procurement, managers, CISOs, executives, whoever it may be. That kind of thread of storytelling is like, hey, we all kind of are thinking about the same things. We might not realize that GRC and like, blue teaming and red teaming and pen testing are more or less kind of the same, different flavors of the same perspective. But, intelligence is really maybe that nucleus with all the octopus arms. Draw your own weird analogy. That's probably a good, AI prompt to get back to your earlier point.
Yeah, and I like that you mentioned storytelling, but I often think it's almost like a narrative. We're all involved in this unfolding story that hasn't been written. I feel like when we say story, it's something that in the past, but we're making this happen right now, right?
Oh, yeah, and that's the fun thing. And I previous, life, I did a lot of like red teaming kind of adversary emulation, but that's always been something I've latched on too, is exactly as you said, like we're in a story and we're also rewriting it. And like the conclusion, like we're just writing next chapters. And, for better or worse, security is one of those things where, like, I don't think this story is ever going to end. So we're just constantly kind of, like, evolve. I mean, there's some of the still, like, fundamental character development of, like, oh, these things still exist. Yeah. But also we're just adding pages and adding new twists and new narratives. But, the story drives on.
It's funny, too, because when I think about it, it's really at its core, it's like the oldest story, good versus evil, right versus wrong. Like, it's pretty epic, yeah.
And just characters plopping in. It's just a hot mess at this point. There's just like, it's like Mario, what was that old Mario game where you could just, Smash Bros. You could just like throw any universe characters from all the place. There's explosions, and we're like, what are we really doing here? This is a mess.
Yeah. The other thing I'd love to talk about related to your experience is the work you did at MITRE. Can you maybe give our listeners a high-level overview of what the MITRE ATT&CK framework is and what value it provides to the wider community?
Yeah, so MITRE ATT&CK is a knowledge base. This feels like surreal doing this again. MITRE ATT&CK is a knowledge base of adversary behaviors. Basically, the idea was adversaries, they take actions, they make decisions. Whether we talk about like initial access or executing code or moving laterally or even identifying their targets, those are just a series of, think about them like Lego blocks. So rather than trying to defend something like ransomware, and you're like, everyone's like, oh, ransomware is a big threat, how do we defend it? The basic idea of attack is let's decompose that and say, well, ransomware, now that we can decompose it and say, well, it's really initial access in these kind of ways and lateral movement in these kind of ways. And now with those very specific ways of measuring it, we can separate, these actors versus this strain of ransomware versus this one versus this initial access broker. But more importantly, as we're doing that decomposition, we can establish two very important things: a common language, where, if I'm looking at ransomware strains and I decomposed it to, 10 fundamental behaviors, I can start to pinpoint those and say, now, blue team, red team, procurement, tools, SOC, I can point to something and say, ooh, make sure we're all looking at the same thing. I'm talking about initial access via phishing. There might be a lot of jargon in our industry, a lot of words, but I can now point to a very, discrete TID and say, that's what we're trying to defend. Let's prioritize that. And that's my second point. Prioritization of rather than looking at like, hey, I'm going to defend ransomware and there's like a million different ways of going about that. I can look at this, see the problem, and then figure out, where am I today? What is the best thing I can defend now? Maybe defending lateral movement isn't my strength. Initial access maybe is a little bit better. Persistence, whatever it may be. But also I can start to plan out the future. Again, getting back to your point about like rewriting that story is this is my highest ROI right now. But if I'm watching what actors are doing and how they're changing, and I'm looking at our capabilities and how we could potentially evolve, how do I map out what we can do better next week, next month, next year, and all of the different perspectives, and bring in again all those resources to actually make that a reality. So that's a little bit of a weird way of describing attack. I know a lot of people talk about like what is actual attack. I love to more focus on like the why, because otherwise, like if you go to the attack website, it could be a bit overwhelming. I mean, it's all freely available, so you can kind of just dive as deeply as you want. But at the same time, like you can easily stumble into thousands and thousands of techniques and dozens of tactics, and you're like, what am I really looking for here? Versus I always recommend people like the best thing you can do with attack is try to see yourself. Like what threats am I worried about, and what do they look like here, and how do I describe them through attack? What defensive capabilities or what defensive processes do we have, and how do I best represent that in attack? And then now that I can kind of see this problem, how can I exploit it to my own gain?
Yeah. And I love that it's almost like an analogy for the larger security mindset of just sort of, breaking things down into components and allocating your resources based on the highest value and ROI, and statistically managing risk, because there's no such thing as zero risk.
Yeah. Cool. Right. And the analogy I always use is like, think of attack like a dictionary. Like if you were learning a new language, like you're doing like an app or something, they teach you like very common phrases, and you're like, where's the restroom? Can I get a tab? I need help. But like eventually, to be very fluent, you're gonna need to decompose that and understand like verbs and nouns and sentence structures and tenses. And attack is gonna be like basically that for TTPs. And then extending that analogy, to be fluent in a language, you don't need to know every word. Like you just need to know like the most important things to you. And exactly to your point, it's like, are you traveling? Are you selling flowers? Are you just like, making, stand-up comedian? That's going to be like a very different flavor of how much of that language you need to know. And that's going to be how you exploit like, this common language of attack is, what are the things that are most important to me, and how do I own those and really like connect that to everything else? Very strange analogy, but that's just how my brain works. So like if there's any listener out there that connected, like, first beer's on me. That's we're like-minded.
Awesome. So you've done a lot of work with behavior-based detections. It's something we've talked about quite a bit on the show. Can you talk about what that means in your eyes, and why this approach is superior to just looking for particular IOCs?
Yeah. So first thing is like I wouldn't even use the word superior. Like if you're familiar with like Dave Bianco's Pyramid of Pain, like I think one of the big misconceptions is like the different layers or levels of the pyramid, or like you're getting better as you're going up. Like you are imposing more cost based on, I agree with that, because you're abstracting it, but it also is like, I don't think anyone in the world would say like, oh, we need to stop blocking hashes and blocking like known C2 domains. It's like, no. That is foundational, information security. I think to your point though, it's like, it's rather than superior, I would say it's more nuanced. Where like, IOCs and indicators in their traditional sense are very reactive, and especially like, as adversaries evolve, we've basically accepted like those are very like point in time. And I think they're very interesting in terms of using them in that way of, hey, we know this actor is using this malware hash or the C2 domain in this window of time. We can go back and check ourselves relative to that window, but there's absolutely no guarantee that extends in the future. And we can kind of do some interesting stuff with IOCs in terms of like deriving insights of like, hey, if I look at IOC, like, their C2 domains over the last 6 years, there's a very distinct pattern in terms of like they do these naming conventions and pivoting to other characteristics. But really, as we move up to TTPs, what the idea is like, it's a balance. Getting back to what we were talking about with research is, how can I, rather than looking at like very, very like footprints in the sand, how can I understand like, okay, like what are they doing? Like rather than chasing Bigfoot on the beach and like measuring like, oh cool, like it's 4 inches wide and 11 inches long, like that's what a Bigfoot footprint looks like. Okay, like Bigfoot runs like in this pattern with this gait, and like if I was sitting there watching like a bunch of people walk on the beach, could I spot a Bigfoot based on like, oh, it's like so tall and has like these distinct characteristics? And again, it's a little bit more nebulous, and I think that's the challenge too, is like, it's easy to come up with those ideas, but then you're kind of limited to tooling, where you're like, well, if I don't have a telescope that has like this kind of aperture, like this is impossible. So I think that's why it naturally was something that, especially at MITRE, we obsessed with, because it's very researchy, because you kind of have to have like, can I come up with a good hypothesis for detecting, like, rather than, you know, an IP or, you know, a domain name, like, what does general lateral movement look like in an environment? Like, you're like, okay, cool, like, it's network connections, it's logins, it's malicious activity probably on both sides of that connection. And like, how do we not only like conceptualize that model, but then looking at currently available technology, how do you implement that not only like in a, you know, in a fishbowl in a lab where you're like, oh, we got it, but then you're like looking at the messiness of a real enterprise, and you're like, how do you scale this? And like how, and to our earlier conversation before we hop on the call, how do I scale this not only for the cyber elite, but like everyone in this space, like a hospital, a school, like that one IT admin who has way too much work? Like, how do we actually productize this so it's easy to do amazing things? And I think that's kind of, you know, especially in my experience, the biggest challenge in that behavior-based space is balancing, you know, the science and the, you know, the almost art of it with the pragmatic nature of like, nuance doesn't really scale. Like, it needs to be, this needs to be easy, and it needs to be like, you know, we need to worry about false positives, we need to worry about implementation, we need to worry about level of effort. So it's a really fun space. It's just, again, remember nothing, like IOCs and indicators still, like, please keep an eye on those, because those kind of just drive so much good practice.
Yeah, and I guess the one good thing about the IOCs, which I didn't consider when I wrote that, was that, like, they're really easy to implement. You know, there's lots of threat feeds, there's lots of tools, like, you can just have those things as a foundational layer. And then I also liked how you brought up the limitations of the technology, because we at LimaCharlie, we make some pretty bleeding edge stuff, and so we're able to do all this really interesting stuff. But the reality is most organizations out there in the world aren't running, you know, cutting edge EDR stuff. So it's,
And for IOCs, it's like, it's for better or worse, they're easy, because it's like so easy to ingest, and it's also so easy to ingest. It's like you can get overwhelmed, and then you have to worry about like
too many alerts.
Yeah, or aging things. I think that's one of the things I've noticed a lot is like expiration dates. Right. Just like, hey, a lot of IOCs age like milk, where you're like, this is maybe good for like a week, and then there are some things you can do that are closer to wine, where you're like, oh, like those big trends of like, oh, cool, like they're spinning up automated C2 domains, and it always looks like this. That's amazing. And then I think that's the challenge too, is like, now you're like, well, I found this amazing insight. Do I share it? Like, I want other people to know about this, but also like, you know, bad gas travels fast. Like, I don't want the wrong people to figure this out, and then it ends up, you know, complete feedback loop. Adversary knows like, oh, saw it in some like, you know, public indicator feed, and then, you know, insight gone.
Yeah, the adversaries are watching the kind of research that gets put out too, so they can change their tactics and evolve.
I'm sure adversaries read their pages on attack. Like, why would you not? It'd be fascinating to know like what the industry knows and what they think about you and kind of how you're represented. Because again, that's just good business.
So for people that are thinking about trying to implement more of a behavioral mindset when creating defenses in their organizations, is there any patterns or examples to like get them thinking in a certain way that you might suggest?
Yeah, and I think a lot of people kind of run to attack for exactly that like use case of like, I'm going to find the most important attack techniques and then try to like detect those. I'm of the mindset of like, again, attack is going to be more like Lego blocks. Like, I wouldn't go into it. I would absolutely not go into attack and say, I'm going to detect every technique. Like, that's a terrible, terrible idea. Like, oh, it's going to be so much work, and it's never going to play out the way you think. But I also think a lot of really good detections are also what I like to call like compound behaviors, where like a good one is like, hey, if I'm going to detect like, you know, malicious code being dropped in our environment, there is a technique for that, like ingress tool transfer. But like really a good detection for that is probably going to be a combination of like a file, you know, some kind of file creation that's coming from like a network like connection to some domain that is a little bit iffy, and then maybe some kind of subsequent like command execution or something that looks kind of like iffy, or like, oh, like that chain together is like more high fidelity than like just like that maps into like what, like 5 or 6 techniques. Right. So I think that's where you start to see a lot of like that threat modeling, like especially like red team, blue team kind of characteristics. And that's where I push people is don't just go with a highlighter and try to like circle techniques and attack. Like you really need to think about like, hey, this like what are the most common things in our environment? And like it could even be at a tactic level of like, hey, like I mentioned lateral movement earlier, like you could detect a lot of lateral movement by network connection between two internal hosts, bad stuff on each side, probably a logon event. And like that could be how you quantify bad is really difficult because it could be like abnormal, it could be known bad. But I think that kind of like modeling is where we need to be. And I think that's kind of, unfortunately, very unique to each organization because it comes down to like, what are the things that not only you're most like worried about, but getting back to your point about technology, what are the things that you are equipped to see and handle? Because not every environment is going to be even close to the same. Do you have a lot of network visibility, endpoint visibility? It's just all going to be a crapshoot.
So yeah, you have this research that you're doing. You have these ideas about adversary behavior. Obviously, you need to test these things. How do you start thinking about adversary emulation in a lab that sort of maps to a real world? Because I'm assuming you don't just think of this great idea and throw it out there and hope it works. You have some proof that it's going to do what you think, right?
Yeah, there's a couple phases of this. And I think like where adversary emulation really comes in is like both on the idea, like the catalyst of an idea, of looking out in the vast world of like, you know, all these DEF CON, Black Hat talks, all these like GitHub projects, real CTI, and distilling that down to like, okay, these are the ones that are most like prioritized for us. I think that's a really important thing for these adversary emulation teams is like staying in line with your business, of like not just slinging a bunch of exploits and you're like, what are they doing? Like that, I don't care about this crap, but like what adversary would be the most topical for our organization? So I think it's like kind of that scoping. And then exactly to your point, kind of on the offensive engineering side, it's a little more like, hey, if we're talking about this, like, you know, file dropper kind of behavior, like a connection, a file creation, and some kind of, you know, code execution, how do I best represent that for our sensors and for our detection? Like I used to say, like, for our teams, as an adversary emulation specialist, we're just telemetry generators. That's all we're meant to do is how do I, like, I don't want to make it too artificial. I need to represent, like, how do I get them the right logs? How do I get them the right events? So again, taking that, like, once you see that model of like, this is how we're going to detect it. Maybe it's not, you know, every variation of this, but this is our strategy. And I think that's why you need your red folks talking to your blue folks of like understanding, okay, that's how the sensor works. That's how the events work. And now as an offensive engineer, I understand how to put telemetry in that pipeline, but I can also think about how to keep telemetry out of that pipeline and say, okay, in terms of how we look at this detection and how this defense works, let's start to assess, to your point earlier about risk, confidence. This is what it will detect, this is what it won't. And now getting back to that scoping, I can measure that against in the universe of CTI and, you know, GitHub and all this like stuff. How does that represent the real realities of what we might see? And again, that's going to be, it's really super hard to quantify, but that's where we start to get into that like risk calculation of like, hey, if we're talking about lateral movement, what can we do? Have we tested it? Have we put data behind it? And what else is there? Is that stuff we need to start growing into, or is that just kind of like the juice isn't worth the squeeze? I think we're high confident that we're detecting as much as we probably can and should.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Again, just sort of balancing resources with statistical probabilities, right? Right.
Yeah. It's a lot of spreadsheets involved in this process.
Are there particular tools or technologies that are essential in the stack that might be lesser known? I know that's a really broad set of stuff. There's so much out there.
I just mentioned it, but like spreadsheets. Like I'm a big fan of like whatever you're doing, keep it simple at first. Yeah. And like documentation is key, and I think especially like even if you're not even doing adversary emulation yet, just like writing down ideas, like we need to look into this, building up that queue is going to be invaluable. So again, that could just be Notepad, that could be Confluence, that could be some fancy, you know, sophisticated suite, whatever. But I think it's a balance of like figure out, you know, what your data model is. And again, like this extends so many different disciplines. Like if you're doing threat hunting, like, hey, like, you know, we have a hypothesis, we have, you know, we do some log kind of triage, like whatever you need to document, just building that out. And then rather than like I hate when organizations, like, not hate, it drives me a little bit crazy when organizations like buy a tool and try to like jam their process into the tool, versus like, I'm a big fan of like, start from like nothing, figure out what process makes sense to you, and by the time you get to that point, the tooling's gonna be obvious. Like if I'm, you know, if I want to drill nails, like a screwdriver is gonna obviously be like, oh, I don't need that. Like that looks stupid. Versus like a mallet or hammer, I'm like, well, duh. Like that's exactly what I'm doing. So I'm like, okay, like grow your tooling out of your process. Don't do the inverse, because otherwise you're gonna be stuck with like, we do these things, we click these buttons, and I honestly have no idea why. It's just kind of like buttonology and, you know, turn my brain off and I think I'm doing, you know, fill in the blank cyber operation.
Yeah, and I think that's something our industry's been guilty of for a long time, is just like trying to put a tool on the problem. But I do think that's changing. I think we're seeing this emergence of more of an engineering mindset in cybersecurity, and people really understand the underlying problems. And now they're trying to, like you said, build the tooling to solve the problem versus finding a tool to hopefully make everything go away.
Exactly. That's my my favorite thing to do at like RSA and like other like tool kind of heavy conferences is like, I don't want to see a demo until you've like talk me through your process. Like if you're showing me a threat hunting platform, an intel platform, like how do you see the process? And then more importantly, what does successful implementation of that process look like? What does a failure of that process look like? Okay, I understand how you see the problem. Now show me your tool. And I can quickly calibrate, oh, I see you have a unique vision and you implement it in the tool in this way, and also see the limitations of like, oh, that thing that you think is really neat, I wonder how far that is in your development pipeline, or is there a roadblock? How does that compare to your competitors? But yeah, I think that, and even I've seen a lot of like even just tech demos kind of lean with that, of like, let the people kind of like wow you, and then it's like, oh, by the way, it's like math class where you're like, wow, like they're doing these algorithms and proofs, and you're like, what the hell is happening? And then they're like, oh, by the way, it's like this button on the calculator, and you're like, oh, this is amazing, like that makes so much sense to me, and take all my money, let's change the world.
Threat intelligence teams inside of organizations are pretty expensive. I imagine you get few people, salaries, benefits, all this stuff. Is there ways that you suggest these teams can show their value or measure their success and share with their bosses about the work they're doing?
Love that question. And two big parts of this is start small. Don't like to your point, every organization doesn't need a dedicated intel team. You can't just like hire, don't hire like, a bunch of experts in the field and just kind of toss them in and like, oh, cool, like they'll figure it out. I'm a big fan of like the second part of this answer is like align yourself with the business. And like, that's not just like, oh, we're in finance, so I'm going to do write a bunch of like pros on financial threats and these actors, and then just like kind of toss them into an email alias and like, good luck everybody. But more start with like, what are the workflows? Like, what am I actually trying to enable? Like, what is actionable intel look like for us? And I think that kind of is more of a process of reverse engineering. Like, what would we do with good intel? And like, hey, if all we're doing really, if our SecOps team is just like updating rules on a firewall, like they're just putting the malicious domains and IPs on it, fine. That's the hammer that we've been given. Our intel team needs to just be giving them, quality IPs and domains, and then we'll expand from there. And I think to your point, that's how you kind of, especially when you think about like metrics and ROI, rather than like, oh, our intel team processed this many indicators and wrote these reports. Like, again, they're going to hear that and like, this is a cost center. Like, why? Like, so what? Like, what did that really do for me? Versus, hey, our intel team, which could be, someone on Friday afternoon just kind of blocks off a calendar, does this. We're blocking this many threats based on this. We avoided this phishing incident. We were able to, we're accelerating IR. We're doing whatever we're doing, but you need that kind of like, where did it go? So what? Why does it matter? Otherwise, it's just like nerds in a room, like pontificating about stuff, and you're like, that's not. I don't really need a philosopher in our budget.
Yeah, you got to make some room for that, but there's also just keeping the business running and supporting the objective, because if nobody's making money, nobody's getting paid. And
and sometimes a lot of, as you build out those workflows, like that's like a lot of the work I do is like being a philosopher, because like, hey, they're like, some of the questions might be, what's the biggest thing we need to worry about in 2 years?
Yeah.
And you're like, yeah, I'm going to need an afternoon for that. That's going to be a lot. But like, I think as long as I can justify, like, it's not just Jamie, like, you know, I just wanted to go on a long walk and drink coffee and smoke a pipe and just kind of like, oh, like, think about it. Like, I actually like, hey, like, this is important because we have executives that are building out long-term budgets and worrying about training, worrying about staffing. And like, this isn't just like musings for the sake of musings. Like, it's again, it kind of captures that context of like, how is this going to make the business that much more threat informed and make every decision that aligns with, you know, us trying to defend ourselves that much more like relative towards getting back to like the whole point of attack. I can justify these decisions I'm making based on like, well, that's exactly what I'm trying to stop. Whether it's a technique, a tactic, an adversary, whatever, a situation, I can measure myself and say, I can see almost immediately as the decision's being scoped and made, what success looks like. Like, hey, if this thing is in lining with lateral movement prevention, I already have my like report card here.
I think you just mentioned it, like the future looking, like so much in cybersecurity is changing right now. Do you see trends changing the shape of threat intelligence, and do you see artificial intelligence having a role in this, or is it just fluffy at this point?
No, I think AI has a really unique role in this space. Like the trends is like, at least from my perspective, I think I've seen a lot of organizations that start to really, really adopt threat intelligence of like, wow, we actually see the value. This is really important. And it's not some kind of like really niche kind of one-off thing that like only a couple folks are doing. So that's really been really great because especially I have a lot of friends in this space and they're like, well, we're really making huge impact for our organization. Like you're seeing a lot of organizations stand up like really robust intel shops, which is amazing because it's one of the, again, with the nature of threat intelligence is very communal. So like to your point, like people, they're publishing insights where there's a lot more sharing. So even if organizations don't have as many resources to devote to that, you can kind of collectively, I guess, transitively like pick up a lot of really great insights, especially as you see like these big incidents happen and like how quickly, like whether it's in Signal or on Google, like public or kind of behind the scenes, all of that great intel's flowing and like we were actually able to address situations very fast. And I think that's, to at least from my experience, where AI plays the biggest role of not necessarily creating like, you know, insights from nothing, but helping us kind of scale that of, hey, I'm looking at a bunch of logs I think are malicious. Can you like tease out, you know, anything that's notable? Or, you know, a classic one is like, hey, I'm an analyst. I have a lot of really good ideas. They're kind of unstructured. Can you quickly put this in a format where I can send it out to my peers?
Right.
Like something that would have like, hey, I had this Wednesday night, I had a bunch of really, you know, important stuff. Rather than like spending all Thursday drafting it, like just toss it into something. It structured it. I was able to get that out Thursday morning. Like,
yeah.
So I wouldn't say it's like necessarily a replacement. It's more of an accelerator. Like the same processes, again, getting back to process and tools, doing all the same processes, but we now have an additional tool that might kind of, you know, help with speed or accuracy or even completeness of, you know, we had an analyst with tired eyes going through a bunch of email logs. You know, maybe, you know, some GPT was able to pick up on it a little bit quicker and like, oh, cool. Like you didn't notice it, but there's a pattern here. Let's tell that to other folks and make sure we're dealing with it.
Yeah. And I love that you mentioned the collaboration too, because I think that's like one of the biggest advantages we have on the blue side is we're all on the bigger mission's the same. And we're really on the same team, right? It's about keeping society running and keeping things moving forward, where we're not going to hopefully see that kind of collaboration with the bad guys because they're selfishly looking for their own ends, right? So that I think is a very big advantage we have.
There's definitely a very, very clear and distinct we versus them. And I love that because, again, like at least holistically, we can kind of learn and grow together. And, you know, we do have a very common enemy. So why not make the most of any resources that can kind of be traded and, you know, bartered between us?
Yeah. Do you have any advice for organizations that are looking to enhance their threat intelligence capabilities? You know, you mentioned somebody taking a Friday afternoon. Is that like a good place to start?
Yeah, I think it just being very, very intentional of like what exactly, like, don't just, again, I think I've seen too many orgs like, if I just get the smartest threat intelligence person and all the right feeds and like I'm going to try to mirror what other people have done. And like I think that it's ironic because in every other paradigm like that actually works of like I'm just going to copy their success. Versus like your success is so unique to you. Like you really need to think about like what would we do with intel? Like what would be the questions that I want answered that would actually help us? And then I think to your point, the other one that really stands out is don't put threat intelligence on an island. Where like you're like, oh, we stood up this threat intelligence like organization and they're just kind of off on their own little, stovepipe doing whatever, pushing out reports. You really have to like show them how the business operates. Like let them side saddle the SOC, let them see how detections are written, let them like, oh cool, like I want to sit in on an executive meeting. Like what are they, when they talk about risk and all the other stuff they might be talking about, who says what, how do they talk about it? Because again, as a threat intelligence like expert, your job is to find data, but more importantly like bring it back and tell a story in your audience's language. So if I don't know how our SOC works, if I don't know how our executives speak and think, I'm going to fall on like, they might not kind of be as receptive, or they might not resonate with the story, versus you really do need to enable them to be that chameleon where like, hey, I understand who my stakeholders are. I understand my audience, and I can kind of go in each one of these like channels and really capture and captivate them to be, the best defenders and the best, whoever they might be.
Great. Are there any resources, books, courses, websites that you would recommend for someone wanting to learn more about threat intelligence?
There's so many good ones. It's hard. I think, the staple in our community is like Katie Nichols has a really excellent like 2-part blog of just like getting started. It's so much like even myself, like I've been doing this for a while. I haven't gotten through all that, but it's kind of similar to Attack. It's more like, this is a good thing to control F your way through. Like if you're interested in, there's some really good resources on like the fundamental philosophy of intelligence, which that's not your starting place. You don't need to read about like, some old doctrine about like what is actual intelligence. I think it's more, there's I almost said like Mandiant. It's now Google Mandiant has a really great blog on like stakeholder driven. I think it's a white paper actually, stakeholder driven intelligence. I think that's a really great one because it's really gets back to that fundamental. Before you start buying feeds and a threat intel platform and tooling and hiring people, sit down and assess yourself and like, what are we trying to do? Build out your criteria and say, okay, now that I can see the questions that I'm trying to answer, the rest of those like subsequent decisions all make sense and cascade from that in terms of what analysts do I need? How many? What do they need to be specialists in? What tools do we need? How does it need to structure data? What kind of reporting do we need to do? Is it taps on the shoulders, Slack messages, beautified PDFs? All of that's going to be back to like what are we actually trying to do? I think those two hand in hand. And I think the other big one is CTI is such a community. There's like, conferences, meetups, signals, Discords, Slacks. Just talk to folks. I think that's one of the big things that really benefited me is like, hey, a lot of us, it might be organizationally unique, but we're dealing with more or less the same things. And like to your point earlier, it's like, hey, indicators. That's something that we're all kind of dealing with in our own way. What are you doing? What's your experience with this tool versus this process versus this? You end up just kind of trading not only like tangible intelligence, but tips and tricks. And I think that's
saving steps.
Right. And I think that's really important too, because again, we versus them collectively, we're all in this together. So there's really no point in like a million different organizations inventing the wheel simultaneously.
Awesome. Yeah. And I'll look those resources up and make sure to link them in the show notes. I know some people love that stuff. So
appreciate it.
The last one I have for you, it's the one I ask of everybody that comes onto the show. It can be as wide or narrow as you want. Do you have any predictions for the future of cybersecurity?
Oh, that's a good one. So I'll chisel this one in stone because I feel pretty confident in this. I think it's expanding. And I think one of the things that I've noticed is cybersecurity is traditionally a very like engineering, like tech, like heavy discipline where we're like, I'm going to like build some product or build some technology or build something tangible that addresses this issue. And I actually love that, the change that I think I'm seeing and I'm expecting more of is it's broadening where it's like, it isn't just an engineering problem. This is a policy problem. This is a procedural problem. This is a legal problem, especially if you think of something like ransomware. It's like, we tried for a while. You're not going to like engineer your way out of the ransomware problem. There is an engineering aspect, but there's going to take so much more geopolitical laws, policies. Like
it's culture now too.
Right, exactly. And it's education. So it's not just going to be, nerds in a lab. It's going to be politicians. It's going to be, so many different folks, military, whoever, pick your favorite way of addressing this. And I think I think, especially thinking about ransomware as a good example, it is a societal problem. So I think if anything, it's more inclusive of like, hey, we need to, especially from the inside the bubble out, we need to help propagate really not just insights and awareness, but good perspectives of, hey, for folks who haven't been thinking about ransomware for the last decade, like this is what we know, this is what we've tried, this is what we've learned, and this is where you can play your part. Or even just, I'm not even going to prescribe what I want you to do with this. This is the problem as we see it. You use your very own unique perspectives and gifts and insights and everything that you've built in your career. How can you add to this? Because again, we're in this together. We've tried our best and we can't cure this, or at least for now, by ourselves. So let's kind of broaden this out and see where it goes.
I love it, man. I love it. And my mind kept going to some like old World War II propaganda posters. I think we need to start rallying people towards the cause.
It's definitely, there's some good memes there. And maybe that's another prediction of the future is memes lead the way. It's such a powerful medium for education. Like, I think that's like my favorite artistry is like capturing nuanced, accurate takes in like easy to digest,
tiny,
right? And it's like that's threat intelligence. It's like, can you educate people? Not only, you don't want to make people feel dumb, you want to make them smart. You want to make them feel smart and confident on a topic. Can you do that with like a little cartoon? Like, oh, beautiful.
It's almost like a neo poetry, right? These big ideas and little words.
This magic. Gotta love it every day, in and out.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks so much for being on the show. This was a really great one. I'm sure there'll be some questions coming in. I'll make sure to forward them to you.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Take care, sir.
Cheers.